Joining me today is Stephen Higashide, Director of the Clean Transportation Program here at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Stephen is an urban planner, and his work has long centered around policy that aims to improve transit across the country, with a particular emphasis on equity via reducing air pollution and emissions through applying scientific lessons. This is a timely conversation as UCS is on the brink of releasing a new report on what we need to do to make transportation and mobility more equitable. Since how we move impacts every single person in the US, this work couldn't be more relevant. So, thanks for taking the time to talk with me, Stephen. And why don't you start by giving us a quick sketch of transportation challenges in the United States?
Oh, sure. Jess, really happy to be here. Um, so, transportation is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the US, 28% of emissions. And, we have known, and UCS has done so much work on tackling that through electrifying the vehicles that run on our roadway networks. The cars and trucks people drive, the freight vehicles that are delivering packages to people's houses. And that is such an essential strategy. But it's also not the whole picture. We also have to look at the fact that the transportation system we have, in a lot of ways, really doesn't give people a lot of choices to get around, can make people feel as though they have to drive for every trip. Maybe they need multiple cars in their household. And that has all kinds of impacts. It's very expensive. Transportation is the second highest piece of household costs, kind of right behind housing.
Wow.
Um, it's one of the reasons why we have one of the most um, energy inefficient transportation systems among developed or wealthy countries. Um, and it really exacerbates a lot of the inequality in US society. And so we are at a moment where I think we can really start thinking about how do we rebalance the transportation system? How do we get away from this kind of cars first, very highway dependent system into one where people actually have affordable, abundant, convenient choices, whether that is bus and train service that's walkable from your house, whether those are safe pathways so you could use an e-bike to get around. Um, we could plan our towns and cities in ways that things are a little closer together. And so even if you are driving, maybe you're driving a little less. All of these would add up, not just to reduce climate emissions, but actually make life easier, more affordable, and give people more opportunity.
Yeah, I mean that all sounds like positive things that most people with common sense would say yes, we need all of that. But I'd like to like roll it back for a second because I think not a lot of folks take the time to understand how we got here. So how has our transportation system in the US evolved into one that entrenches poor health outcomes and difficult commutes for people
Mhm,
from lower income, more vulnerable communities? Like, how did all that
mhm.
happen?
A lot of it goes back to the really significant role the federal government has played in building out the interstate highway system. And, obviously this did some things that you'd say are good. It made it easier to get from city to city. Um, it was in some ways, safer than many of the roads that it was replacing. But the interstate highway system also tore through city after city and displaced millions of people, primarily Black people, people of color. And the impacts on those communities really kind of reverberate all the way to today because, states will go back, widen the roads in those same places, and just compound impact after impact. You know, in the uh, in kind of the public health world, we often talk about cumulative impacts. The idea that you can't just look at the public health harming pollution from, say, a power plant or a highway in itself. You look at the fact that all of these things tend to be in the same communities. And when you look at the transportation system, those highways are going through the same places that already are host to so many environmental injustices. And while there have been federal investments in transit over the years, they just don't add up to this enormous sum that we have continued to spend on more and wider highways. Long after I think almost any expert would say that the system is complete. In fact, in the late 20th century, um, the government actually declared the interstate highway system functionally complete, but we keep going back to cities, widening highways. In some places, there may be 10, 20 lane roads. And the federal policy, in a lot of ways, is doubling down on what is not working. And we need to do something different. We need to give people uh, abundant transit, safe biking and walking. And there are a lot of ways we can do that, whether that's at the state level, at the federal level, and of course at the local level. So it's many decades of policy that have got us here, and we have the power to stop digging this hole.
Right. And so what does not having good clean transit options, what does that do to individual people in terms of their health? Because I know that is one of the big driving reasons that we're re-examining a lot of transit options is that it's
Mhm.
hurting people.
Yeah, that's right. We often think about in transportation, we might think about um, how poor air quality impacts public health. But when you look at lack of transportation options, it's often more about what health experts call the social determinants of health. And those are things like, is it easy for you to get to what you need? Is it easy for you to get to the doctor's office? Is it easy for you to get to a job or education that's going to give you a good quality of life? Is it easy for you to see your friends and people in your community? And what happens when folks don't have those options is it's really a kind of social isolation, lack of opportunity that ends up having huge impacts on people's health in a number of different dimensions. And that's really true, not just in cities, but in rural areas too. We often think about public transit as a city thing, right? But it's actually in many of these rural places where there tend to be a lot of older residents, a lot of low income residents. It's having something as simple as a bus that runs every hour to a major city that's going to connect you with the hospital you need, the stores you want to visit, maybe family you have in that city. And without those options, it becomes really hard for people to age in place.
Yeah, I actually love that you went to the rural areas because that was my next question was, I wanted to talk about the rural communities because, a lot of Americans and people living in the United States, live in places that are not population centers. So, you don't have access to subways or trains and sometimes maybe some bus service, but it's not the most robust. So, how when we look at these solutions, you mentioned having more bus service available, but are there other transit solutions that can help out in rural areas?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm going to start by actually coming back to the bus for a second,
Okay.
because there are some places in the US that are doing a good job of this. So in Colorado, for example, in the last few years, they have started up this statewide bus service that they call Bustang. So, like Mustang, but a bus. And the bus actually has a picture of a horse on the side of it,
Oh my god.
very on brand. And I mean, it's just a coach bus running on major highways connecting all kinds of communities to Denver, to Colorado Springs, to other cities, but passing through the very rural areas. And the ridership has just been exploding over the past several years. And I think it just helps show that in a lot of cases, we don't actually need some kind of super innovative, high tech solution. We have a lot of solutions that can work for people if we have the planning and the funding. People are really clamoring for some solutions that are pretty simple to provide. Um, and then, I think when we think about rural areas, rural can mean a lot of things. And one thing that it often means actually is really kind of classic Main Street towns that actually are pretty very logical places to serve with transit. They are population centers that people are trying to get to. They're places where if you had safe sidewalk networks, they could be places where maybe you drive, but you just park once and get everything you need to get done in that area. Um, they are often places of natural beauty that folks might be trying to get to, and having more transportation options is really helpful there. Um, so just to say that there's quite a diversity of rural areas, and the kinds of transportation options that folks need are going to vary depending on what that place looks like.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenge we have as a country is that it is such a diverse place, both with people and in terms of geography. It's pretty massive, and there are a lot of challenges. You've got beaches and mountains and deserts and everything in between.
Hmm.
But you did mention technology, and so I wanted to talk tech for a moment because
Sure.
I think most of our listeners, at least, are pretty familiar with electric vehicles. But can you tell me how much of an impact on pollution, climate change, and health outcomes going electric with our nation's cars and trucks and buses and freight vehicles? How big of an impact can that have?
Yeah. Well, so earlier this year, um, the EPA finalized two rules that will really help clean up uh, light duty meaning, passenger cars and trucks, and heavy duty, meaning everything from tractor trailers to a number of kind of smaller trucks. And those rules don't require electrification, um, but combined through 2055, they're going to result in 8.2 billion metric tons of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which make them some of the most ambitious climate rules that have ever been passed in the history of the US. So that's just to give you a sense of the magnitude that and to say that if we can then go even further, if we can get to 100% electrification, um, it really is just a massively important piece of cleaning up transportation emissions. And we do believe that we have the technology to get to 100% in in those sectors. Um, so then I want to note, okay, so where does like giving people more transportation options fit in? Part of what it does is that it can make this transition to a 100% electric transportation system. It allows us to do it more quickly, more affordably, because if you have 100% electric cars and trucks, but people don't need to drive as much, then well, you don't need to build out the grid as much. To pick one example, you don't need to build as much electric distribution, and so you're just giving yourself a mountain that is a little bit easier to climb, which is really important when we're talking about how quickly we need to achieve this transition.
That's super interesting food for thought too. I mean, it makes perfect sense, but I think it's not something that a lot of people consider. I know a lot of people are very into their cars, but we'll come back to that. But I wanted to know what are some other ways that technology can help us move forward. So other than just electric vehicles, because I'm sure you
Hmm.
have lots of options for us that maybe we've never even heard about.
Yeah, well, okay. So when we think about public transit, it's actually a place where the digital revolution can really improve the customer experience. Um, just to give a few examples, in the last few years, it's become a lot more ubiquitous where you're getting on the bus, you could just tap your credit card or you could even tap your phone. You don't need to think about any given places like proprietary fare card or like the complicated machines in the subway station. You can just kind of show up and pay with what you have on you. There's much better information around when transit is coming, and that technology actually can really help on the back end. It can help the folks who are operating public transit understand, okay, the bus in front. If I'm a bus operator, say, there can be now often there can be like a little computer on the bus saying, okay, the bus in front of me got a little delayed, so I should hang back a little bit too, so that the spacing between the buses is even, and folks waiting at the bus stops have consistent service. Um, there have been a lot of improvements um, to what in the transit industry people talk about demand response service, which is basically the ability to make transit a little more like uh, Lyft or Uber, where you schedule a ride, something shows up, and it might be a shared vehicle, and that kind of transit is never going to replace like a subway or a busy bus, but in more rural and suburban areas it can be a really convenient solution that is affordable both for members of the public and the public sector. um, and I think maybe the last thing I'll say on kind of new technology, talk about electrifying vehicles. I think e-bikes have become just really exciting for folks as well, and something that a lot of households are finding actually can replace a car for a lot of trips, even to take your kids around, do grocery shopping. There's a New York Times columnist, Jamel Bowie, who has an e-bike that he loves. He's always posting about it on his Instagram, and he's really replacing trips that his family would have needed another car for.
Yeah, I think examples like that, real world examples, really help people understand the possibilities. And so we just talked tech, but it's not the only way we can change things. So what are lower tech ways that cities and towns can help reduce dependence on fossil fuel based transportation?
Um, I think a lot of this comes down to what you might call just basic town planning. Like, can you build a kind of main street community where it's easy and convenient to walk to what you need? Um, are you building housing near the public transportation systems that you have? In a lot of ways, these are solutions that really cost almost no money but have huge impacts. And I think you kind of see um, in so many cities, whether it's cities like New York, but even places like Houston, Austin, Indianapolis. Um, Local leaders everywhere are just really embracing biking, walking, and public transportation. And I think that one of the kind of other issues that then points to is, are state governments helping, or are they or are they getting in the way? That's really one of the keys to um, that's really one of the keys to whether a region has been able to transform its transportation system. And
So
I could get a little more into that, but
I think it might actually, you might, with what I'm about to ask you. I want to know who is invested in resisting the transition to cleaner, better transit options, and what do they stand to gain from protecting the status quo?
mhm. Yeah, I mean, in a lot of cases, it has been state legislatures and state departments of transportation. Sometimes it is really blatant. So there have been some high-profile examples where, say, the Tennessee state legislature, the Indiana state legislature, both tried to actually ban bus only lanes. And in both cases, their capital cities had these projects on the books to build bus rapid transit, which is kind of a system where you give the bus its own lane. You give people really good information. The bus is coming every 10 minutes, and so it provides this really great level of service. And state lawmakers just really threw a wrench into it. And I think part of that is a kind of anti-urban politics. Um, and we talk about this a bit more in the report that we have coming out. So I don't want to scoop it too much, but they're really entrenched interests. So much of the money we spend on transportation actually ends up in the pockets of fossil fuel companies, who are profiting off of gasoline and diesel. Um, there's so many industries involved in building roads, and they have a lot of clout in legislatures, and so it's really important for uh, members of the public, for scientists, for advocates to organize and talk about the kind of transportation systems we need.
Yeah, I think it's very important to look at who benefits from certain whatever actions that we take or don't take. So, what are the costs of staying hooked into our current system from a financial perspective? I mean, I know there are people out there who love their internal combustion engine cars. So, what is our incentive to switch from our wallet's perspective?
hmm hmm Yeah, I think there are two pieces of that I want to dive into. The first is, if you just look at what the public sector spends on transportation infrastructure. So where do our federal tax dollars go? Where do our state tax dollars go? We're spending tens of billions of dollars every year on a system that mostly puts it into maintaining and expanding highways, and we're getting very little benefit from that at this point. You know, we know that when you widen a road, within a few years, typically the traffic just comes back. It's something that transportation engineers call induced demand. Um, and if we were spending that money instead on giving people other options, um, we would we would just we would make it easier for families to get to school, for young people to get better jobs, for older people to age in place. The effects would just kind of ripple throughout society. And then that is really just that's not even accounting for the personal costs. The fact that owning a private vehicle comes with many thousands of dollars a year in upkeep. And we've created a situation where a lot of families feel like they have to have two or even three cars. It's a really crushing burden. And I mean, just think about what you could do with a big chunk of that money back. Um, I mean, it's like what you want to do with it is going to depend on who you are, but it just is a huge amount of of additional choice that you have in your life.
Yeah, I know paying off our cars. We don't have any car payments right now. We've paid them off, and I live in LA, so unfortunately, car is sort of a way of life here. Although we do make efforts to minimize, and we have one we barely drive because the other one is a Chevy Volt. So we've kind of done the electric, and we were an early adopter of the Volt when it came out, and it's been great. So we've seen the benefits of not having to fill up at the gas station, and the
Hmm.
electricity doesn't cost us that much at home. So we have had a good experience, but I know that there are a lot of people who, unless you can show them a real financial benefit, they're really hesitant to give up the keys or to even just drive less. But so I want to ask you because you mentioned Colorado, and I actually grew up there, so it's cool to
Mm.
hear about the Mustang. I'm gonna ask my Colorado friends, if they've taken it. But I wanted to know if you have any other success stories for us about places where they have made changes to how people get around and what
Hmm.
those stories are.
Yeah, I mean, one of the places in the US that I think is one of the most important success stories is the Seattle region, where in the early 2000s, um, both the public and local and regional leaders just really made the decision to heavily invest in public transit. And there's now this very extensive light rail system with kind of new stations opening every few years. In fact, there were two big pieces of it that opened earlier this year. um, Not only that, members of the public have voted again and again to, I mean, to increase their own taxes, to like expand bus service, to fix up sidewalks and make it safer to walk around, to build out this regional rail system, and to build, tens of thousands of units of new housing close to those transit stations so that people can live there, people can access these options. And as a result, Seattle has grown and grown and grown, but driving hasn't. They're doing this thing where they are growing without traffic. And in fact, Washington State as a whole is a place where people are driving less. Um, and it's one of only a few states where that is happening. Um, and it just kind of shows that, this the story of, having good transportation options. It's not something that only happens over in London or in Tokyo or Mexico City or all these places that folks in the US might go on vacation and then talk about, oh, it's so great. You could take the train there, we can walk around. Why can't we do it here? It's like we actually are doing it here. And Seattle is a place where we're really doing it and people are really using it. Um, and it's a place where the state government, to get back to something I said earlier, is actually really supportive, and for a long time has had programs to, for example, um, really incentivize people to commute to their workplaces using non-automobile options. So it's a place where the local policy and the state policy are really working together, and it's been just transformational.
That's very exciting. I'm sure that my friends in Seattle have noticed a difference. That's actually cool because it kind of proves that it can be done. You can grow without adding tons more cars. And, do you have any stories from places that are, I would say, a little bit more conservative leaning, where they've tried to improve transit options? Because I know that people like to say, "Oh, well, that's just, it's just LA, it's just Seattle, it's just New York." Are there any
Hmm.
spots around the country that are a little bit more, I would guess, yeah, conservative, maybe more from red states that are they're doing this work?
Yeah, that, and to say, the I should point out that the pandemic has definitely made it harder in some places to keep up the political momentum, but actually, both Houston and Austin, Texas, have had incredible momentum on transportation options. They both um, they both had reorganized their bus systems in ways that not only added service, but really focused on frequent service, focused on making sure that more people could walk to a bus that was coming at least every 15 minutes, which is it's one of those things that is really important because it means you don't have to plan your life around the transit schedule. You could just kind of show up and get to where you're going. They started there and they built on that momentum to expand their rail networks as well. Austin had a referendum where people, resoundingly voted for transformational investment in 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 a new train system. They're in the process of building it now. Um, Indianapolis, which is a place I mentioned before, has been successful in building some bus rapid transit. And when you look at the folks who were advocating for that, it was this coalition that spanned the business community, all the way to the faith community and social justice groups. There was really a consensus that that is what the city needed to keep growing its economy. I think in a lot of ways, giving people more transportation options is very uncontroversial at the local level. When you talk to average people, when you talk to, say, city council member, I think it's really a no-brainer. And it has only been at the federal level that it has become more polarized and has been kind of brought into the culture war in a way that's really unfortunate because it's just about giving people options. It's just about giving people some freedom to choose how we get from one place to another.
Yeah, and I would hope that most people in this country are into freedom, but you never know. But we're wrapping up here. So my last question on This Is Science is a two-part question, and I ask everybody this. So as you well know, we're the Union of Concerned Scientists. So Stephen, why are you concerned?
Oh, why am I concerned? Wow. I mean, well, I think that a lot of parents would probably say this, right? So I have my son is about to turn 3 years old, and of course I'm just constantly thinking about the kind of world that he is going to inherit. Um, when we do our work in the clean transportation program, and we're kind of planning out, okay, what are we gonna work on? What are our goals? We're often talking about, okay, what do we need by 2030? What do we need by 2035? What do we need by this date? And it's like, all right, what is it going to mean when he's in high school? What is it going to mean when he is kind of stepping into the workforce? And of course, it's not just about him, it's about everyone. Um and it is just about, like, what are we leaving for, and what are we doing for the communities around us? I think that when I work on transportation, we often talk about, say, mode choice. How are we going to choose to get to this place? Am I going to pick my car? Am I going to pick public transit? Am I going to pick my bike? But transportation is important not because of those individual choices, but because of what it means for our communities, and whether we can build the cities, the rural areas, the regions where people have what they need to get ahead in life and have a good quality of life, have safety, have public health. It's all about building the community that we want. And so that concern is always on my mind.
Well, okay, so I do wanna wrap up on a high note. So, what are you doing about that concern?
Oh, well, wow. We have a really exciting slate of analyses coming out over the next year, by which I mean like the folks on the clean transportation team are just diving in and helping us understand so many different aspects of the kind of transportation system we need, whether that is more transportation choices. We have work looking at why we need to recycle electric vehicle batteries. We have work looking at how EVs could connect to the grid and help people power their homes, make communities more resilient. We're looking at progress in cleaning up the freight sector. Uh, there is just when I look around at the clean transportation program, the folks on that team, the kind of analysis that we are doing is just so essential to policymakers, and it's going to make a difference. Like we don't know what's going to happen with we don't know what's going to happen with politics, right? But we know that the work that we put out either is going to help us advance the vision of a clean transportation system, make even more progress, or it's going to be really important in defending what we have. And so being a part of this like solutions oriented team is something that really inspires me. I joined the clean transportation team just about a year and a half ago, and I think the folks around me are really at the forefront of 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 def- cleaning up transportation in this country. It's really an inspiring group of folks.
That's a great answer, and everything you said today was amazing food for thought. So, I really appreciate you taking the time, Stephen, and thank you for the work you're doing, and I will look forward to seeing what comes out of our clean transportation department, going forward.
Thank you.